My wife and I, along with 4 other friends, had a wonderful trip this fall down the Rhine River. It was a beautiful time of year to do it, but the highlight of the trip for me was Cologne, and especially for the cathedral in Cologne. A magnificent medieval building. Well, part of it's medieval, the rest of it's newer. A beautiful building in a city that was almost totally destroyed by the Allied forces when, at the end of World War II, except for the cathedral, which remained standing in some sense. And going through the cathedral, we had a guide, and I said to the guide, these are really beautiful windows, are they all new? And he said, no, they're the originals. I said, what do you mean they're originals? This place had 14 bombs land on it. He said, in the early, mid-30s, church officials began to understand that this rise of Nazism was not going to end well. And that they decided that they better protect some of the treasures of the cathedral, so they started taking the windows out. Hi. That's fine. So they started taking the windows out. The result of taking the windows out is that when the bombs did fall on the cathedral, they had nothing to bounce against. So the concussion of the bombs just right out through the open windows. And therefore the cathedral itself was saved. They had to replace the roof and some other things, but on the whole, it was saved. The second part of the cathedral, and the reason it was so important, was that Helena, Constantine's mother, discovered that in India there were the remains of the 3 wise men. Now, there are lots of myths that find things going on, but given that, anyhow, she gets the bones of the 3 wise men, takes them to Constantinople. At some point in history, they end up in Milan, and at some point in history following that, they end up in Cologne. And so the cathedral in the 12th century was built to house the reliquary of the 3 wise men. A beautiful, beautiful piece of gold and silver and gems sitting right on the high altar in Cologne Cathedral. Now, why did I raise that issue? I raised that issue because it was a world in turmoil, political and religious. And we live in a world of political and religious turmoil. We might think of the dean of the National Cathedral saying, I see all these treaties getting canceled. I think, let's just take the windows out and put them someplace. It's probably futile, because if it were a nuclear bomb, it wouldn't make any difference. But we live in those times. And the Gospel of Mark is also written in those times. Jesus comes into a situation in which Israel is occupied by the Romans. They are under the empire. And he comes in and says, the kingdom of God is among you. I'm coming to bring the kingdom of God. Now, we've heard that phrase so many times it doesn't even bother us at all. Archbishop Williams said, it'd be better if we read it, I'm here to make a regime change. Now, that's not good news to people in power, as you're well aware of. But let's go 2,000 years ahead, and here we are in the midst of another political and religious upheaval. And there are all kinds of people out there saying, I'm going to make a regime change back to the way it was, to another direction. Everybody has their idea. And then we look at what Jesus is doing, And we see the regime change he's talking about isn't right, left, or middle. It's a whole different way of perceiving how we live with each other and how we live with God. And he shows us some of this. Mark shows us some of this, and he's telling the people in Mark's little community in Rome who are under terrific persecution. People are dying left and right for the faith. He's telling them it's going to be okay. You have to have hope. There was a commencement speaker at Northwestern this year who said, hope is, what did he say? I'm having troubles this morning. Subversive. Hope is subversive. Thank you. Give it anyhow. People will follow. And so Mark's whole thing is showing Jesus as a person of hope and how to get there, how to change the regime. And he says, in order to live, you have to die. In order to die, you have to live. Or, in other words, take up your cross and follow me. And we're still trying to deal with that conundrum of what that means in our lives. It's not easy. And he shows us some characters. The first character we see a couple weeks ago is a rich young man. And he comes to Jesus and says, how do I get abundant life? And Jesus says, well, you know, you've got an awful lot of money, and you're pretty attached to it. The best thing for you to do is give it all away and come follow me. And the rich young man just walks away. He can't do it. But notice Jesus doesn't run after him. Jesus will let us stew in our own juice. And the next week, we run across two disciples, James and John. And they come to Jesus and they want something from him. And Jesus says to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they say, well, how about when you come into this new kingdom, we get seats of power, one on your right and one on your left. And Jesus says, oh, you don't know what you're asking for. Let me tell you what it means to be a servant. And he explains what servanthood means in this new regime. Now, remember, all along here, Jesus 3 times has predicted that the way to the kingdom is through persecution, death, and resurrection. That's how we live in the kingdom. And we still don't understand that very well either, and we still work at it day by day and week by week. And then he comes to Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus is a blind beggar. He wasn't always blind, but he was a blind beggar, and he's picked the best spot in town. He's picked the spot right on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. And Jesus and his people are on their way to Jerusalem, and we know what's going to happen there. And Bartimaeus cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Now, he got one thing wrong. This Son of David stuff is really pretty dangerous thing to say in the old regime. You don't want to put yourself out as somebody who's going to replace the king or the emperor. You don't want to do that. So the people try and shush him up. Maybe for that reason, maybe because they just think he's a pain in the neck. But anyhow, Bartimaeus cries out all the more, Jesus, have mercy on me. And Jesus says to the crowd, tell him to come to me. And he jumps up, throws off his cloak. Now his cloak, by the way, is kind of his badge. It tells you that he's a beggar, because he spreads his cloak out on the ground, sits on it, and he throws money in or whatever into his cloak, like people with their hats out or cans in the railroad stations or wherever these days. So he jumps up. Oh, one more thing. He's a beggar and he's blind. That means he's lost his family, he's lost his community, because he's considered a sinner, because he's blind. And oh, by the way, that lesson you just heard from Job, that whole last section of where Job gets it all back, isn't part of the original. We have to stick with the first part, because we don't always all get it back. It's an important lesson to learn, but we may get a whole lot more. What? We knew that. Some of us do know that. Some of us think you're still going to get it all back. Anyhow, he throws off his cloak, the last thing he owns, and goes to Jesus. And Jesus says, just like he did to those two disciples, what is it you want me to do for you? And he says, Teacher, I want to receive my sight again. And Jesus says, go. Your faith, your trust in me has made you whole. Now, I want to point out something else that happens in Mark's gospel. And that is every time we see one of these things, one of these healings, or a casting out of a demon or something, the person always is in relationship to Jesus. Jesus doesn't go around willy-nilly and saying, I see you're sick, you're healed, or get rid of that demon. He doesn't do that. You always have to establish a relationship with Jesus. You have to trust Jesus, that Jesus knows what's best for you. And when you have that trust, something happens. In Mark's gospel, miracles are not the point. Trust is. Whatever you get from Jesus is because you have a relationship with Jesus, because you trust that Jesus can do it. Miracles are the easy way out, and there's nothing easy about Jesus' way, because it heads straight to Jerusalem, to a cross and a tomb. So, we're left with Bartimaeus. They're on their way to Jerusalem. And I ask myself the question, do I hear Jesus say to me, tell me what you want me to do for you? How would you answer that question? Pretty clear what Bartimaeus wanted. James and John, they said what they wanted. He couldn't give it to them. What do you want? Being on this way to Jerusalem, being on Jesus' way. Remember that the early Christians were called the people of the way. That's why you have feet on the top of all of your bulletins these days. We're people on the way. And being on the way these days is not an easy way. I read a thing from that Maya Angelou wrote. She said, I'm always amazed when people walk up to me and say, I'm a Christian. And I always think to myself, already? You've already got it? My, you're fast. It's hard being on the way these days. So, we practice. We practice at this table where there are no boundaries. We practice as we try to influence those who would not honor the dignity of every human being. We practice when I saw just the other day a new writing of the Bremen Declaration. In the early 30s, when the fascists came into power, the state church approved of the fascist government. But there were a whole lot of people, a lot of clergy who met in Bremen, Dietrich Bonhoeffer being one of them, who said, no, we're not going there. We don't not believe in this regime. And they wrote a declaration of what they would do and what they would not do. And a new one has just been written, that invites us to join in, and some of us have already signed it. It's a declaration about what we will not accept in the new regime. Non-violently, we will not accept the degradation of other people. We will not accept the economic restraints we put on people that make them dig deeper and deeper and deeper into the hole that there is no bottom to. You can guess most of the rest. I invite you to go online and see what it is, and invite you to, I signed it yesterday, and some people saw it on Facebook and they signed it too, so good for them. You were one of them, Julie. I think the rector is going to sign it too. Anyway, what? You already have, right, you just haven't published it yet. Anyhow, it's hard to be on the way these days. So, how do we do it? How do we answer? How do we go to the question that Jesus asks of us? What do you want me to do for you? And as I said, we practice at the table, we practice in all kinds of ways. We open our hands and our hearts and our checkbooks to give hope to those who have so little hope. And we always practice this other thing that's so important for us to remember, that I have a log in my eye, and I ought to be real careful about how I take the speck out of your eyes before I deal with my own log. We're all blind in one way or another. So one of the things we want from Jesus is to see deeper and better every day. Bartimaeus gave up everything to see, even if imperfectly. The Magi did the same without ever knowing where they were going or how it was going to end. We have migrants, legal asylum seekers, you, me, trying to listen to the question, what do you want me to do for you? It's always Jesus' question to us on the way, because it's always the question that the lover asks of the beloved.